webinars and the follow-up email. And without further ado, I present to you Dan D'Amico.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Leah. Hello. It's great to be here. This is, I think, the third of these that I've done thus far. A little background on what I plan to talk about. First and foremost, the general topic of this presentation is this book, The Art of Not Being Governed, An Anarchist History of Upland Southeast Asia, James C. Scott. Hopefully, some of you guys got the opportunity to read parts of the book or the whole thing before this webinar. I also have a forthcoming paper that is a response and comments on the text. It's less about the book, admittedly, and a lot more about trying to apply and trace patterns of social behavior that Scott points his finger at in the case of Southeast Asia, and seeing if we see similar patterns and trends in our own contemporary experience of coping with the state. And we'll talk about what aspects of the text inspired me to do that in the course of the lecture. But I also want to mention that paper forthcoming in the Review of Austrian Economics is part of a entire collected volume dedicated to responding to Scott's book. So if you've read this book and you like it and you're interested in it and you're interested in things like Austrian economics and public choice economics, you should definitely be the next forthcoming issue of the Review of Austrian Economics, edited by Chris Coyne. So first and foremost, what I think is most interesting about Scott's text is he describes a very unique narrative of feudalism that takes place in Southeast Asia. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Bruce Benson's work, Benson at one point describes of the transitions of legal systems and monarchical legal regimes in feudal arrangements in the Anglo-Saxon history as contractarian or quasi-voluntarist. And in my own work on the ancient Greece experience, there's a similar contractarian undergirding to feudal arrangements. And this is, it's in contrast to the way a lot of traditional historians view the experience of feudal serfdom arrangements. Now, on the one hand, it looks like, at first glance, when you look at those sort of arrangements, that indentured servitude services as de facto slavery, that peasants are perpetually indebted to feudal masters, and they receive portions of the grain that they harvest, but it's sort of barely enough to survive. The tax and expropriation is significant, and so they're destined to these sort of continual lives. In much the same way as free market economists discuss the functional capacity and the preferable alternatives of things like sweatshop, there are certain characteristics of the feudal farming arrangement that had a degree of voluntary contractual arrangements, and in some instances, insofar as serfdom arrangement to live in a competing or nearby farming community, you got higher qualities of say security services and legal arbitration processes, lower rates of expropriation, sort of like a Tibu competition model that operates across states' provisions of public goods in the United States today. in the reason what would the environments being exploitative and coercive would be a low amount of alternatives, right? If there's only sort of one feudal lord and the direness of the alternatives. So again, like with sweatshops, for example, sweatshops in urban preferable alternative compared to the sort of even more dire circumstances that are available on farms with high rates of disease, co-living amongst livestock, much hotter extreme working conditions, lower life expectancies, etc. So again, there is some functionalism and some degree of contractarianism observed in the Athenian feudal experience, and a large part of it is driven by the fact that individuals serving as labor units in these arrangements had a very difficult time coordinating credit. You couldn't borrow capital to make investments in small-scale business ventures and in small-scale farming because you had no assets. The only asset that was available was your future labor hours. Now, what's interesting about Scott's case is, tragically so, is how not voluntaristic or contractarian the feudal experience in Southeast Asia appears to be. Essentially, he describes how human population, the real commodity of power, that wealth in a material sense was not what grand say, in large part because the growing conditions and the geography of the area were such that there was very little physical assets to accumulate. Once the techniques of rice agricultural farming were developed, it's a very labor-intensive process. Have a small or a mid-sized rice plantation, apparently, it's sort of like go big or go home. And in the go big circumstance, you definitely need a lot of labor to operate the plantation. And so if you didn't have people willing to work on your paddy, you essentially had no value in the land that you, according to formal terms, owned. So the feudal lord experience, rather than merely offering a preferable living arrangement to the harsh conditions of the confines of a city, rather than providing public goods like security or gains from trade by clustering amongst other people, they really had to compel labor units, populations, to flee the underdeveloped areas, lay to waste the natural space. They would burn the forests and the resources where tribal communities lived relatively hand to mouth. They just a general sort of harvesting condition of naturally growing fruits, vegetables, etc., as opposed to adopting formal systematic agricultural processes. But so by destroying the sort of free space, they forced them into the feudal agricultural arrangement. Now that divided the indigenous populations into sort of two camps. Those that, after the decimation of the wild space, viewed the feudal arrangement as preferable to the non-producing wilderness, rice cultivation and indentured servitude, de facto slavery, or those that fled and experienced a more explicit form, not necessarily just of destroying the agricultural space or the natural terrain, but rather were explicitly hunted and genocided by these feudal kingdoms and authorities, retreated into even more obscure and hostile geographies. So there's a little bit of background. James Scott is a Marxist social historian. We tend to really like this guy Gabriel Kolko, who was a Marxist socialist historian of the progressive era in the United States. And funny enough, when he found out that there were all these sort of libertarian types reading his book, he wasn't. Kolko's book is very much welcomed and complementary to Austrian public choice insights because it's an unromantic view of government. Kolko explains that despite the intentions of progressive at the time was that progressive regulation was reining in corporate big interests to the benefit and protection of middle class, working class type America. Kolko points out that the realities of both the histories of the, as well as the effects of those policies were far cahoots with vested large-scale business interests. In other words, when you design a regulation, say, you're a hamburger stand like McDonald's, you have to guard to keep your employees from getting burned by the deep fryers. This flash guard costs $500. Well, now, anytime a joint wants to open up, they have to pay an additional $500 in order to get in the game of competition in burger delivery. Well, that insulates of the vested business, the larger scale corporate interest, McDonald's. And so when regulations, Monday there's no regulation, Tuesday we're about to regulate, we'll sort of jump in and sit at the table. They get to sort of, they get to see the regulation coming down the pipeline. They get to estimate and for reasonableness in a way that they know that they can comply with. Scale. They've got it's only a marginal cost on them, whereas it adds to startup costs for entrants. And this sort of unromantic view of government is very much in line with public choice incentives, Austrian knowledge problems. And I think Scott is in a lot of ways a modern next coming of Gabriel Kolko. I hope that Austrians and public choice economists read him and appreciate his due, Gabriel, in large part because what Scott ends up describing is very much, again, another aspect of the role of government, which, again, challenges a view of political economy. Being a Marxist social historian, I would argue it reaffirms perspective of political economy. The story that Scott is telling is one where states commit explicit acts of genocide upon indigenous populations. And those indigenous populations being their once long established habitats, hostile terrains like bizarre mountain ranges and trees and very rudimentary economic conditions for generations. Now again, there's emphasis on geography in Scott's book. And ordinarily, I wouldn't like that. Ordinarily, I would imagine Austrians put off by how prominent a role Scott gives to geography's influence on the social institutions and patterns of social behavior that he describes. The first reason why I'm willing to give him a bit of a pass on this, well, first to explain the reason why Austrians would be sort of, that the Austrian tradition through and through of social processes and social phenomena being grounded in human decisions, human intentionality, the social. It's not biophysiological reasons that prices or values of goods and services exist in society. That's actually like what the marginal revolution was all about. Ascribe to a labor theory of value. We don't ascribe to the notion of sweat equity. It is rather a consequence of choice and an interaction of human preferences and subjectivity that we get prices on the market. So to emphasize so much about geography is strange from an economist perspective. But Scott's not an economist. He's a social historian, and so the geographic emphasis, I would argue, does make sense for his purposes. So to defend that first, the metaphor he uses is just really cool to read about. I kind of geek out on this. I don't know if anybody else gets joy. As this description where he says, if you want to understand how to think of controlling people, because again, power is linked to controlling people in this, own people, so to speak, then you can't cultivate your land and you can't necessarily do anything to produce the forms of value and wealth that you would want as a political ruler. So in order to understand how the ease or difficulty with which you have to harvest populations of humans, he invites his readers to imagine like a three-dimensional map space, a model, a terrain, and then pouring a very thick and viscous liquid paint on top of it, and perhaps tilting and sloshing the paint across the different caverns and three-dimensional spaces of the map model. And what that is meant to sort of invoke in you is a recognition that, well, yeah, you know, some places are just really hard to get to, and some places, insofar they collect the paint and it stays there persistently, like that's sort of like a notion of geographic or locational equilibrium concerning where it is that people choose to settle. Where it is that people choose to settle naturally or voluntaristically would be those areas where the paint sits and collects naturally. And the areas where the paint doesn't go is where it is that these sort of refugee genocided populations explicitly. Now, being in these isolated environments makes it big capital to grow their economy, to develop their economy. So they for generation upon generation. Admittedly, this is a bit of a puzzle. I don't particularly have a good answer for it, especially since. So I know that it's the topic of one of the paper volumes. So I'm very sort of like, this is a teaser. Virgil Storr and I had a conversation about this, and he was saying how it's almost as puzzling as, say, Amish communities. Amish communities, generation after generation, despite of the benefits of an advanced division of labor, of all the cool gadgetry and hot chicks that live in metropolitan environments, yes, many of the Amish youth leave their communities, but sufficient amounts stay to retain the population of their community and cultural identity. Which is to say that they have to be offering something in exchange, some form of club goods, some form of cultural asset, because it's not an economic one, right? There's no, like, it's not like you get a little back by your retirement party from being Amish. And being a hill person of Southeast Asia, living in tree houses, and so again, I think so. Virgil asks critically, like, why is this cultural identity persistent, even though the genocidal threats have long. And so that's sort of the motivation of his paper going. Again, I'd like to defend Scott for using the geographic approach, because at the saying that it's not that geography is the economic poverty, that like these where sort of up mountain and treetop canopies and things of that sort, those environments constrain economic development that's capable. It's hard to get resources there. It's hard to grow crops there. It's hard to diversify an economy there. It's hard to transport goods and services out of there. Like, it's to expect that society to develop. The best you would hope for is that society to move, but the reason why it was selected for is not because of a general appreciation of that geographic condition, but rather as a cost-avoiding strategy of running from the state. That coins this fantastic phrase when I came across it, fell in love with it. He calls it the state effect. He says the state effect, a shatter zone, that when wilderness spaces and when these individual tribes genocide, they shatter, often distant, they spread as far and distant as they could, and then practice nomadicism for periods of time. So, and he calls that these shatter effects, these state effects, are inevitable consequences of ultimate cause of inhibited these people is interventionist and expropriative and predatory states. It's a very different way of interpreting the effects of geography than, say, someone like Jared Diamond, who thinks that that geography is the influence on a story of so why both being sort of historic, more attuned to bioprocesses than, say, social scientists? Why do Diamond and Scott come up with such different? Because the cases that Scott, mainly tribal societies and primitive conditions, primitive economies, it's a very different puzzle. Diamond starts his book with so much cargo. Why do poor countries in the globe, why do rich countries in the world today gain wealth? The variance of economies in Diamond's narrative is tremendous. The variance and the path dependency stories are sort of insufficient to wide variance. That's for Scott. He's dealing with tribal communities, all with relatively low economic conditions. So it's not like he needs to explain why tribe A or tribe B, nobody's inventing the steam engine. Everybody's sort of living in, there's food production, there's remedial clothing and weapon production and housing or some form of shelter and hunting and transportation and communication. And that's like sort of it. And so the degree of variance, institutions, the things like the cultural processes, the conflict resolution strategies, the things like marriage, things like trade norms within those societies, they reflect more so the influence of the adaptations than they do the influence of their unique conditions in their accumulated capital. In this sense, I would argue that Scott can be fit within or next to Eleanor Ostrom's work. Now, these tribes as a whole and geographic regions, historical experience, so he's but a single case. Whereas Ostrom sort of collects lots of cases and pays particular attention to single institutions within them, mainly resolution of tragedy of the commons, and how it is that particular resources are managed and maintained in optimal production. But what they both are sort of relative statelessness, conditions wherein the conventional forms and the traditional forms of the nation state, the geographic monopolies, the systematic administration of justice and violent enforcement, absent by accident, or in this case, it's that these peoples fled from predatory states. In Ostrom's, the variance of her cases sort of alludes to this in much the same way as there's no significant overarching authority governing international trade of historical times and places. In Ostrom's cases, there's nothing to unify the separate cases that she investigates. And so I think like the real implication of that of those findings is that in those conditions with the absence of violent state enforcement is precisely those instances where you see adaptive forms that match well the unique geographic conditions. So for Ostrom, it's really a process of cope with one's geography that you get effective uses and maintenance of resources like fisheries or water maintenance. I mean, the reality of the situation is that if you want to run water filtration in a city like New Orleans, if you want to run water filtrations in Las Vegas, right? One is very arid and dry, and one is very wet and swampish. And so if your model of efficiency for water maintenance is pure state involvement and centralization, processes of trial and error that accumulate the types of wisdom and lead for an adaptive decision-making process to the necessary types of adaptations for that.
Hey Dan, I'm sorry to jump in, but we're getting some sound issues. Would you mind taking down photo booth and seeing if that helps? Because it keeps breaking out like every 2 seconds.
Taking down.
Yeah, just.
Is that better?
I think so. If you continue, I'll just jump in if it doesn't get better.
Or you want me to shut down some other programs or something?
Just shut down photo booth and you can just keep your desktop up like that.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So, geez, Lee, you messed me up. Okay, so this aspect of fitting Scott within a broader sample of case studies involving statelessness. So where we have statelessness is where we see functional variants of institutional types. This is the thing I think is greatest about Scott's work, because on the one hand, seeing the types of adaptive discovery in environments where states are explicitly absent reaffirms the classical liberal perspective of political economy. It reaffirms the notion that order is naturally occurring, and not only is possible without the state, but it age for the constitutional project of classical liberal political economy, because as firsthand that as a naturally occurring process to it, that spontaneous orders are the process of knowledge accumulation, the process of innovative discovery. It means something explicit about the potential for state power or misapplications of systematic violence to disrupt those otherwise occurring processes of check on the potentials for something like progressive political economy, where we constantly seek goodies from the state. The state is this sort of giveaway provider. I realize now everyone's just staring at my picture of Stevie Wonder. That might be awkward. Sorry, you'll just have to deal. So, admittedly, despite, again, being a Marxist social historian, Scott gets both of these insights, right? I mean, Scott describes and recognizes the forms of social institutions amongst the Hills people of Southeast Asia, amongst conditions of statelessness. He also coins the phrase and shadow zones to describe lasting negative legacy of coping with predatory state. What I like the most about Scott's analysis is how reasonable his explanation really is. When someone like Scott, with as much historical familiarity, and the geography again plays that degree of his expertise, it just sounds like the facts. It's not a terrible stretch of interpretation to describe these processes as predatory states and then adaptive tribal customary norms emerging thereafter. Now again, in this a trait of ecological or contextual rationality in the vein of, say, Vernon Smith, or a lot of what George Mason economists are doing today. The notion of contextual rationality, the way I think of it is it puts us in in parallel position as, say, biologists or taxonomists or something. When a biologist discovers a very obscure species, a reptile with horns coming out of its face in weird directions, or a flower that has strangely shaped petals and an awkward color and aroma, or an insect with wings that are just woefully disproportioned to its size. We don't look at it, biologists don't look at these bizarre-looking species at first glance and say, oh, this must be from an alien planet because it defies all of the rules of evolution that I've grown accustomed to. Instead, the research project becomes, well, I must find the unique circumstances which contributed to an evolutionary process that resulted in these strange adaptive features. It must be something about the way that this creature was predated on by predators. It must be something about the way in which this creature found food. It must be something about the way in which this creature selected its sexual mates that over time selected for this type of particular biological characteristics. In economic terms, when we see behaviors that fall far outside the pale and strike us as bizarre or awkward, such as people living generationally on and on and on amidst hostile geographies, amidst conditions that do economic production or the accumulation of capital or wealth creation, one could say, the financial wealth is the only form of utility that I know of, therefore these people are irrational, therefore makes no sense. But that again, the ultimate cause to this behavior was genocidal states. It makes a much more rational explanation of these evasive behaviors, rather than them being optimal per se, right? Certainly there could be better places to live. Certainly there could be more productive ways that some of these tribes could devote their labor efforts to accumulate capital. They could overcome these conditions, and they haven't necessarily purely or hyper efficiently optimize their conditions, but rather, given their limited information and given their extreme constraints of an extremely violent and pervasive threat, not against any of their individual people, but against their community in total, a la genocide, it almost makes any bizarre or adaptive strategy seem rational, right? When death is on the line, people are willing to do lots of things to avoid that extreme, to avoid bearing that extreme cost. And so, again, the counterpoint to this is when Scott tells this story, it seems obvious. Yet, as an economist reading a geographer slash Marxist social historian slash anarchist book, I can't help myself but think, well, what would a traditional or mainstream political economist say if they were given this sample or case study of people living in bizarre conditions in the middle of Southeast Asia, rudimentary farming techniques, hunter-gatherer lifestyles, bare subsistence living conditions, lack of medical care, etc. What would a conventional political economist have to recommend is, I mean, the closest thing that comes to mind is something along the lines of Jeff Sachs, which is, oh, well, we would need to thrust a ton of capital, a huge financial aid injection to jerk them out of poverty, to get them up to a competitive level, to be interconnected with the global economy. Again, just as much as Scott's story seems so reasonable, obviously so when you read it, thinking in these terms seems so obviously unreasonable, because I mean, Bill Easterly is a great, and Peter Bauer are great on this insofar as like the institutional distribution of aid matters, right? You end up subsidizing bad institutional forms. You're basically funneling money into people who are responsible for suppressing economies. I mean, in the context of the Hills, it would be like Easterly on steroids, funneling more money to the very political interests that sought to eliminate and exterminate these indigenous populations would be catastrophic. In that vein, realizing how out of place a conventional model of political economy would be to resolve Scott's case, and ironically, the tools of conventional political economy, right? Market failure theory, the call for public goods, the corrective role of government, is explicitly meant to chime in when information is asymmetric and property rights are poorly or weakly. Well, that's the Hills people of Southeast Asia in a nutshell, and yet those conventional models of political economy seem not effective. So with that in mind, when I drafted my paper, I wanted to say something about how the absence of violent enforcement is something that I think is particularly special in this context, or well, in the Ostrom case. In this context, you see the shatter zone as an explicit reaction to violence, right? The reason why they're willing to take such extreme geographic measures is because of how potent the violence by the state against these people was. And so what the economic intuition would tell us is that the sort of consumer surplus of value that's being extracted by this invasive regulation could in turn be reinvested if the institutional arrangements were different. Were this predatory state not around, then these indigenous populations would have an opportunity to invest time, effort, and energy in other ways. Now, the fact that their cultural institutions are also sort of obscure, I think resolves some of the puzzle that Virgil brings up, that they create the eventual returns to group membership. But what concerns me about the inability of contemporary political economy models to bring resolve to the dilemmas of Southeast Asia is the fact that the same patterns of a negative state effect by imposing violent enforcement and subsequent shatter zones and extreme investment in evasive tactics seems present in contemporary society. It seems present in arenas where the state is most explicitly or must rely explicitly on violence. Now remember back to Scott's definition of shatter zones and state effects is that they are inevitable, right? They go hand in hand with coercive state making, right? The notion of forcefully bringing indigenous populations under state control, dominance, ownership. To some extent, I would pose the following question to contemporary political economists. If he can identify comparable shatter effect where people being forcefully regulated must invest in what I would say is copacetic behaviors, things that with an invasive governmental actions. If we can see those things, should we term the state involvement in those circumstances as coercive state making? In other words, so in political economy we make distinctions between the size and the scope of government. The size of government is sort of just how big or strong your state is, how much money and how capable it is to do any particular thing. Whereas the scope of government of things which it is responsible for doing. Now, in a limited and constrained state environment, it's police, courts, etc. In a more and social welfare providing state, you get lots of other things. You get public transportation, school systems, medical care, so on and so forth. Well, in mechanism is pretty weak, but it's not terribly in the tax code. It's funded with spending and debt and deficit finance models, and so ordinary people in the citizenry don't feel it as an state making. But there are in contemporary society where states do have to resort to much more invasive violent enforcement to gain compliance. And here I have in mind the end ism abroad. And if you see very comparable what seem like irrational behaviors, but that they are in fact effective at coping against state violence and predation, seem infinitely more rational. So in the case of the war on drugs, what I have in mind is that, well, you know, people persist in the drugs generationally, and the financial returns are not incredibly high, nor are they relatively or marginally high than sort of menial work opportunities in those local economies. So Stephen Levin commented that crack dealers make little more than minimum wage, if that, with their mothers. And another sense in which it almost appears irrational to persist in these behaviors is that our criminal justice system has been tooled in such a way that according to the rational model of criminal behavior, say Gary Becker, 1968, Economics of Crime and Punishment, raising the severity of punishment and raising the frequency with which it is applied should, other things constant, deter criminal behavior. Now, we have done both of those. I mean, empirically, it's almost twice as likely for you to be convicted once captured of a crime, and an average sentence length in the last few decades. While violent crime has declined, one of the sort of enforcement strategies of drug war, it's not necessarily clear that net population participation in the war on drugs has declined, nor that individuals in a generational setting, sort of children of children of children, are less likely necessarily to be participants in the war on drugs. In fact, You get continual repeat offenders, higher underground network of trades that a host to the illegitimate market, and a form of culture which glorifies and supports drug dealing lifestyles. And it's those features, and on the consumer end of drugs, a willingness to risk your own health to consume very low, potentially low dangerous substances, a willingness to tolerate extremely addictive drug materials for lack of available substitutes. And it's the magnitudes of those adaptive behaviors that we should recognize, again, could be in product innovation, quality improvements, and institutional environment. Of military interventionism abroad, what I have the notion of terrorism and blowback. Namely, that the notion of things like suicide bombing, while often involve the radicalism of faith as an inspiring contributors. The parallel to historical case warfare is too close to ignore. In other words, we didn't refer to Indians in the French and Indian War as terrorists. In history books, it's the particular case in point opportunity to teach about the changes that occurred as almost a creative destruction point of military tactics. That it used to be that regimented, that military strategies were very, that there was a nobility and a conventional regulatory apparatus that governed. Like you would march in battalions and you would scream, aim, fire. You would wear big, silly, colorful soldiers' uniforms. That works fine in competing factions in military engagement have comparable. It doesn't work very well if you're in like a David. So during the war, when you have fighting against the French, so to speak, with Native American forces, Native Americans were into a much more obscured terrain. They were used to hiding and strategic maneuvers, to stealth, etc. And so they were eventually defeated by the sheer firepower, but proved a very formidable opponent nonetheless. And so the concept and narrative more attention to the obvious rationality behind terrorists in military experience, because who are really able to funds and sort of ability to navigate the Middle East and so on and so forth, then noticing that your opponent is of the United States, little seems effective, but for attacking planes or attacking civilian retaliatory effort, if insistent on doing, regardless of what religious context you do so. that both of these cases really should, in the perceived effectiveness of the same way as marginal aiding a Southeast Asian context would probably contribute to abilities of local governments to in genociding those populations, is that an additional marginal military interventionism abroad is probably more likely into a marginal increase in blowback/terrorism, dollars spent on enforcing the war on drugs domestically perceived to entrench of the black market in drugs. In fact, in the war on drugs context, we're seeing happen in a lot of underground literature is that the criminal networks are using the forms of enforcement and punishment as signal on production functions. Things like prison stays prove as a rely for people to recognize whether or not you're a person to trust and how long a participant experience in etc. And so again, these the presumed of state enforcement prohibitions and what I would regard in arenas of coercive state making should, I mean, basically what I'm saying is that we've comfortable and accustomed to our conventional political economy models that it's great to a context like Scott's, if only so that we can see how they might lead us to ignore when similar processes are happening. So Leah's yelling at me, and I definitely want to field some Q&A. So Leah.
Hi, Dan. Thanks. So the first question, we've actually had like 5 people ask. Where did you get your tie?
Oh, Express.
Okay. And then the second question is, what is your favorite Stevie Wonder song?
Seriously, nobody cares about James Scott and the art of not being governed. It's disappointing. You guys are Philistines. Well, my favorite Stevie Wonder song is Uptight. My laptop's name is Stevie.
Okay, so now to the more serious questions. Is the state endogenous? Do the strategies you've described to avoid predatory state mean that the state cannot be formed naturally and through more or less voluntary means?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think in the context of, say, these like tribalistic communities, I think that governance, mainly accomplishing the challenges that are posed by coordination, can be resolved endogenously. And that's precisely what work like Ostrom's demonstrates. Now the question is whether or not processes are sufficient to govern tasks that involve conflict resolution of like a criminal / like conventional role of justice avenue of the state. And again, I think that lots of work implies yes, it can. And in fact, I would interpret the history, the legal history, to say that we only have effective states providing those functions insofar as they got to free ride off of long histories of accumulated and competed and contested social processes that contributed to institutions from endogenous source or legal system in the West, Anglo-Saxon legal merchant that emerged in the common law before we had states involved in it. In a contemporary society, not necessarily looking at these sort of like state of nature, but rather like taking the world as we live in it right now, governance is totally capable of being endogenous in arenas where we have states, that we don't necessarily need them. So again, this is a question of the scope of state. Could we have endogenous enforcement of property rights in urban environments? I think absolutely we could. Could we have endogenous production of public goods like roads and or on and so forth? I think of course we could. Could we maintain international defense? Could we maintain an entire system of conflict resolution and criminal law? I think we could. I think the case is probably harder to make in those arenas. But again, the structure of the argument as far as what is this, like, we should think critically about sort of like slicing off scopes of the state and thinking about it there. Like, in much the same way as Scott is describing, well, the state went over this mountain range into this particular territory. In a very, like, parallel narrative, that's what happens when we see things like the healthcare market. Well, the state, its regulatory control over financial markets, so on and so forth. I mean, you're talking about an arena that didn't used to have, and it does. And the processes of reactive agents within the system and like reaffirming biases on the part of policymakers parallels very much similarly how Scott's narrative plays out. Any more questions, Leah?
Yes, we have a ton. Would you say that the fact that this particular society is under constant threat backs it into such a stage where they can't develop any capital, however it's defined in society, that they have to focus on innovation out of the anarchy-based state of nature?
Well, it's not just constant threat. It's like what the margin that they innovated on was finding places that were hard to get to so that they wouldn't be constantly threatened, right? I mean, it really is an exchange of liberty and security, right? Which is interesting. It's in one of the puzzle that Virgil is wrestling with is the fact that they're right, but they have grown somewhat adapted to these obscure geographies that it's difficult to now pull themselves from. Leah, you still there?
Yep. The next question is, any insight as to why Scott or even Gabriel Coco, despite the seemingly radicalness of their critiques of state power and state action, are nevertheless still Marxists?
It's partially dialectic in nature. Like, for people who talk so much about it, they seem remarkably guilty of it. It's in Kolko's analysis, he really the role that corporate interests have played in the history of society, and I think that there's something very similar in Scott, that the motivation for populations is the profit motive, no doubt, and it is a systematic aim of producing. And so, I mean, it's a function of the fact that they have a confused understanding of capitalism. It's a function of the fact that, I mean, I would be skeptical to think that either of these two profound authors would agree in total with the likes of, I don't know, your average Marxist revolutionary at your like college campus communist meeting or something. But rather, they're Marxist social historians insofar as they use Marxist teleology to approach historical narratives. And good Marxist social historians, like I think Kolko and Scott are, don't let that be the alpha and omega of their analysis, but they use it insofar as they are willing to criticize dominant vested interests as being culpable for many of the problems that occur, if that makes sense. Leah?
Okay. Our next question, what options does Scott provide for the state of Asian in the developed world?
Not many. I mean, he's a historian. I think, I mean, he's definitely not a constitutionalist. But so I guess like and this is something that I've come across not necessarily in reading Scott, but I do think is interesting in light of like Ostrom's work and Scott's work and others like it, is that when you read, I mean, most of what I guess you would call like post-colonial literature, there's a lot of people who pay a lot of attention to small indigenous groups